Our hip hinge movement is going to be the foundation of a lot of other movements that we do. So we're going to start with a hip hinge, and then we're going to build on into a deadlift and into a good morning. As you're doing all of these, it's also good to think about the hip hinge as the foundation for a lot of our bent over positions and our stable positions for other movements. It's pretty foundational. So we're going to take it slow and make sure that we get it right. We're going to start with your feet shoulder to hip width. I want this to feel fairly neutral to you. So kind of wherever you, if you were to jump up in the air, wherever your feet landed, that is probably your neutral stance. That's about where your feet should go. Take a look, get used to where that is right now. From there, I'm going to have you find the crease of your hips. Just go ahead and stick your fingers there. And then we're going to push our hips back. It's really helpful to have a mirror for this because oftentimes what happens is we think that we're pushing our hips back, but really we're just pushing our fingers in and we're leaning forward. So one thing to think about with this is as you push your hips back, you want to have most of your weight in your heels. If you're watching yourself in the mirror, what should be happening is your hips should be moving away from your feet, and we want your shins to stay perpendicular to the ground. Once you get down to here, you're going to squeeze your glutes and push your hips back up, and then we'll push your hips back again. If you don't have a mirror or you need a little bit more help figuring out what that feels like, you can back up to a wall and start maybe 6 inches, 8 inches in front of a wall. Push your hips back. And when you hit the wall, you'll know that you have been pushing your hips back. Then you'll take a small step forward a little bit more. You'll push your hips back. When you hit the wall, you'll know that you've done it. And that can help you get used to the movement of hinging your hips back rather than just leaning forward to pick something up. Your knees will bend, but only to accommodate the hips. So that shins perpendicular is really important. If you start back, but then you bring your knees forward, you're doing a squat, bring your knees so that your shins are perpendicular. That's what makes it a hip hinge. So option 1 for hip hinges are going to be just keep your hands down in contact with your body in the front. Option 2, once that feels fine, you're going to raise your hands over your head and still push your hips back, bring your hips forward. Push your hips back, bring your hips forward. You only ever have to go down as far as your back is parallel with the floor. Again, a mirror can be really helpful for this, as can filming yourself and watching the video to see what your body's actually doing. From a hip hinge, we can move into a deadlift, which is going to look very much like the hands down hip hinge that we just did, but we're going to add a weight. So for a kettlebell deadlift, you'll start with a kettlebell between your feet. You will hinge back and soften your knees until you grab it. You'll squeeze your glutes, come back up. Keys for this are that you want to keep the weight directly between your feet. You don't want to swing out or bring it out here. That's going to put a lot of pressure on your low back. We want the hip hinge to stay pretty much in the back of our legs, in our hamstrings, and in our glutes. So we'll just go straight up and down. That is going to be our kettlebell deadlift. You can also do this with a dumbbell. I happen to have kettlebells, so that's what I'm using, but it works just as well with dumbbells. We can do another kettlebell variation or dumbbell variation with 2. So instead of setting the weight down directly between our feet, we're going to set them to the outside, but in that same position so that they're in line with the balls of your feet and effectively in line with your body. We'll start with that hip hinge back. We'll grab, squeeze our glutes, come right back up. And again, you want to keep them close, come right back up. So we don't want to swing out. We want to keep everything in this line so that we feel it in our glutes and in our hams. Depending on your height, you may or may not come down to the ground. I'm very short, so my weights touch the ground. If you're very tall or have very long legs, you might end up having your back be parallel with the ground, somewhere closer to your knees or mid-shin. That's fine. Use a mirror, work within your own range of motion and your own body to make sure that you're keeping most of the work here. To get a little bit more of a unilateral effort, we can take one of those away and do what is called a suitcase deadlift, which is really just what we just did, but with only one weight held like a suitcase. So for these, you're going to go through the motions that you just did, exactly the same, except that because you only have the one weight, you are going to have to work to make sure that you don't twist offline and collapse into the side that's using the weight. So I like to press out through my other arm to make sure that my shoulders and my hips stay level with one another and that I'm not twisting as I go. You can do these movements with a band as well by standing on the band and coming straight up and straight down. One thing to know about the band is that it will feel loose here and will feel much tighter here. So you just want to make sure that you play around with the tension so that you're holding it in the correct spot to get that glute and hamstring engagement from about the top 2/3 of the motion, and let the bottom third about feel maybe a little bit too easy. So those are our deadlift variations. We also can use the hip hinge to do a good morning movement. A good morning movement is a hip hinge deadlift movement, but when we have the weight coming positioned above our waist rather than below our waist. So for good mornings, we have two options. We have front loaded and back loaded. I'll show you front loaded first. Using a kettlebell or a plate or a dumbbell, you're going to hold that into your chest. What I like to, the way that I like to think about this is you want to hold it like you're trying to hold a cat that wants to escape. It's kind of a silly cue, but you know what I mean, right? You're going to hold that tight against your chest, maybe hold one hand over your arm, and you're just going to pull it in with all of your arms. From there, you will hinge your hips back. Think about setting the weight and or your chest down below your knees or between your knees, back and up. That's just going to give us a little bit less lat and upper body engagement and be a little bit more specific here. We can also do a top-loaded good morning. If you have a barbell, you can use a barbell. If you don't, you can use a plate or a dumbbell or a kettlebell. And you'll just kind of bring it up over your head and hold it there like this. This should feel fairly neutral. You should just let it hang as much as you can. And then from there, you will do your hip hinge, feeling probably more of your lats, more of your back, because it's going to be a little bit more of a struggle to keep your shoulders from coming down. So your lats are going to be engaged there. To get out of this, you have a couple different options. You can kind of curl down to the side and just let it fall. Or if it feels a little bit too heavy and you feel suddenly out of control, you can come up next to a chair or the ground or something and set it down there, and that can be an emergency exit. But those are our primary hip hinge movements, which are the hip hinge by itself, our deadlift variations, and our good morning variations. Now you try.